What is this over? What is this technology?
The technology is a mechanism for operating the price discovery function of marketplaces. The closest existing analogy would be things like the stock ticker or ticker tape machines. Um, Basically, markets, broadly defined, exist really in prehistoric contexts, economic activity. If you're just using market as a synonym for the phrase economic activity, that's what it is. But the modern financial market, which goes back to the Renaissance, is based on the use of tools, and those tools have been improved in various ways over the centuries. In fact, one of the things I'll be bringing up is that probably the most important patent in American history was a marketplace device patent. Edison did not invent the ticker tape machine, but he did patent a upgrade to the ticker tape machine, and this is when he was still pretty much a homeless vagabond, uh, uh, working the rails and the telegraphs. And he was contacted about having a financier buy the patent off of him. And he apparently wrote in his diary that he expected to receive something like $60 or $70, but he had resolved to have the other gentleman make the first offer to sort of get a notion of what the price was going to be. And the opening offer was $40,000. And that's the money that he used to found Menlo Park. Uh, and so if that patent didn't exist and wasn't sold, light bulbs to washing machines to movies to, phonographs to all the, ancillary secondary things that don't have his name on them, like radio, television, and so on, might not exist today.
Wow.
Uh, so at any rate, I have a mechanism that people would use in a different way than we use existing markets. But if people are willing to use this mechanism, it creates a greater efficiency in both the economic and thermodynamic sense. And so right now, uh, US government figures suggest that we spend probably in the neighborhood of $1 trillion a year organizing our economy. This technology could allow that number to be reduced by in excess of 90%. And so that $1 trillion a year would be available to advance the state of our economy. Since the US economy is between 20 and $25 trillion, that would be a 4 to 5 point increase in the growth rate of the US economy. Since the US economy has a long term growth rate over the last 40 years of 2%, that would be a
450% growth rate.
potentially, yeah. Now, if you just cut that in half, you get a 100% increased growth rate. And if you're familiar with the way infinite series works and net present value, doubling your exponential growth rate doubles your net present value, which means general adoption of this technology would probably double American and, frankly, human wealth.
That's pretty amazing. Are you willing to dive more into this and why it's substantially different than the current system?
Absolutely. Be happy to do it. Uh, so effectively what happens is that the existing model is based around the notion that there are buyers who are people that have access to cash and have information. And there are sellers who are people who have access to product and information. And so the purpose of the marketplace is to provide a forum for the exchange of product for cash, but also to extract that information and create the amalgamated market price information. which happens indirectly. It's essentially by recording the prices at which trades occur and publishing that information, people can sort of see that pattern and they will cluster around whatever the right answer actually is. Um, what my system does is it says, okay, what if we create separate forums for information, product, and cash, so that people with information provide, just call them price guesses, for future trading opportunities, which would then be integrated together in a reasonably-ish straightforward manner into the amalgamated price condition, and then this effectively pre-negotiated all market price gets presented in a kind of fiat manner, and those people who have the goods and the cash can decide how much they wish to participate. Something like how grocery stores work. You go to the grocery store, the price is on the shelf. If you like tuna fish at this price, you buy it. If you don't like tuna fish at the price, you don't buy it. In aggregate, those buyers and sellers measure. If the shop discovers that they're overpricing gummy bears and they can't get rid of them, then they'll cut prices. If they discover that they're underpricing milk and they can't keep it on the shelf, they'll raise their prices. And so that three-way system allows for more efficient distribution of cost and so on than the two-way system does, because the information isn't indirect anymore.
Sorry, I'm just sitting here thinking about it because my day to day is so familiar with the grocery store analogy versus the market analogy. And I understand the market analogy difference. So you're saying instead of having two, you basically have two sets with two variables, that now instead you've got three sets, each with one variable.
Yeah.
Those are simpler equations by nature. Just thinking about it mathematically.
Yeah. The tricky bit is that you have to shift the incentives. So it's well known that if you know what everybody's preferences are, it's simple to calculate the market outcome. That's pretty much the theoretical justification basis for socialism. However, it's also well known that if you actually ask everybody what their information is, they'll lie. And so, because it's in their direct personal interest to lie about their own personal situation under those circumstances.
Less
Because
discrepancy from endowment affect.
Right. Well, and also because if you're going to do this, if you're going to take a set of people's preferences and do a computation to work out how to maximize the preferences, if you lie, and that's taken seriously, the equation will benefit you by lying. So by lying in the right direction, you will cause that system to act in a way that benefits you. So there you go.
Right.
So what I discovered is a way to do these separations and set it up so that you effectively don't benefit by lying to the system. You benefit by telling the system the truth. And it's not dependent on people telling the truth or even being terribly accurate, because it can rely on the kind of wisdom of crowds effects. It effectively works by discovering medians. And the reason median discovery is so important is that markets behave non-scatically. You may or may not have ever seen financial reporting where they talk about sigma moves on a day. But if you have, you will have discovered that 15 and 17 sigma moves are not unheard of in marketplaces. And of course, that's utter and total nonsense. There's no such thing in our physical universe is a 17 sigma miss. Um, what's happening is that they're taking a underlying distribution that is some version of a power law fat-tailed distribution and pretending like it's a normal distribution. And that doesn't work at the extremes. And that's why the mechanisms that we've been using, particularly over the last 30-ish years, with things like the Black-Scholes equation, are associated with increased market turmoil and sort of decreased economic happiness of the entire population of the planet, because we're using a control mechanism that's wildly underpowered for the problem that it's meeting.
So these are some pretty this is a pretty big technology.
Yeah.
And it's important. And I'm sitting here thinking myself, looking at the current system, how would this impact the current systems that revolve around the current marketplace, the current economic systems, like the day traders, things like that?
Well, it's different for different things. I actually pulled together something called the story matrix that sort of details 16 different roles, but let's hit some of the biggies sort of up front. The market operators themselves, the CME Group is a publicly traded company. They say that they're getting a little under $1 billion a quarter in revenue.
Okay.
As I'd mentioned before, the overall costs that their marketplaces are imposing on the economy in general are on the order of $1 trillion. So if they or anybody else decided to create a competitor market using this technology that charged, say, $500 billion at scale, not upfront, but as it grew up and became full-sized, up to $500 billion, that group could decide to collect 400 billion of that $500 billion. They could take an 80% skim, and not only undercut the pricing of the CME Group, but also out revenue them by a factor of 100. And because, as you noted, the equations and consequently the computation are also simpler, their operational costs would also be a small fraction of the operational costs of the CME Group. So operators could either run pilots and then self-cannibalize as they upgraded, or be wiped out by competitors that decided to be well enough capitalized to get a seed running and then take over. That's what happens at that phase. For the professional traders, hedge funds, high frequency, and so on, these can be broadly subdivided into two groups. There would be groups that have the ability to generate alpha, that have actual relevant and important pricing knowledge. And then there would be the groups that are exploiting flaws in the existing market design. And there's going to be a lot of overlap. Most people are going to have some of both of those with, shades of gray. But for the people who are making money by exploiting the flaws in the existing market design, they're going to find that they can't recover any of that revenue. So they're going to need to find some other business to go into. For people who can generate alpha, people who have actually relevant market information, the way that this integration of information system is designed to operate, the ROI is actually a free parameter of the system. It basically works somewhat like a parimutuel system, or like a pot, like in poker. But rather than having a rake for the house, there's actually a bonus that comes in from the trades that you're facilitating, which creates this incentive to create the most economic trades that are possible. And so that can by adjusting the amount that you have to invest to get shares in this income stream, it's possible to adjust the average ROI. And this is something that's not currently possible in our financial system, which means that they would be able to make a lot more money from their risk capital than than any other opportunity that's ever existed durably would ever do. Right now, if say the bond market starts experiencing very high rates of return, people will start flooding money into the bond market and lower the average rates of return in the bond market. This could create a marketplace that has durable average rates of return that are whatever you want them to be when you set them up. I usually ballpark it at 100% annualized. That might be too low, but that's still, 3x or more of the highest rates of return that have been durably reported by anybody in the history of markets. So that's going to be very attractive. And then we get out to what I call sort of the edge users, the actual producers and consumers of base commodities. They get to enjoy this lower cost. The spread between what farmers receive and what factory owners pay varies from marketplace to marketplace. Sort of more mature and more liquid markets, it's down around 6 or 7%. In other places, it gets pretty wild. The average, again, according to U.S. government statistics, is 16%. So every $6 spent on commodity product produces $5 to the commodity producer. Cutting this in half, $6 spent would, $12 spent would produce $11. So you're looking at a 10% increase in gross revenue in fields where you're getting, margins that are in the low to mid double digits. One of the most fun ones. Oil's pretty liquid. The overheads there are probably, oh crap. My lights just blinked again.
I saw that. You're still here though.
Yeah. So oil companies operate with like 8 to 12% margins. The oil market probably has like a 2 to 4% spread, but even if it was a 2% spread that got cut in half on an 8% margin, that'd be a 12.5% increase in your gross profits, or in your net profits rather, just for switching markets.
That interests me. I do a lot of work internationally in these realms. I don't do a lot here in the US, but I work in RWA internationally, and fascinating stuff. Real world asset digitization is what I mean to say, but what would it take to even like deploy this at a small scale and scale it? Because the patent office says it's not like important. What if you just built it?
Well, setting up a marketplace is expensive. There's the customer acquisition, which isn't free, but much more expensive than that, at least initially, is just getting the permissions. So doing it at large scale is very expensive. For point of comparison, the state of Texas has recently decided to launch a marketplace to compete with Chicago and New York. This is pretty insane unless somebody there finds out about my technology and decides to deploy it. But they spent, I think it was, the numbers I've seen reported are a little under $140 million just in compliance. And for large scale marketplaces, I talked to the IEX guys when they were going through the compliance system. They spent about $100 million getting compliant, so that they could be in operation. You can sort of do these things simultaneously if you're sort of moving down that road and are going to plausibly get to the end of it. You can operate at low levels and stages as you're going through. You don't just have to, pull together a pile of $100 million in cash and then, have government agents torture you for half a decade before you're allowed to talk to anybody. But it's pretty, you can't avoid the $100 million in the torture, unless you've already done that. So um, that's the upside. Now, that's the United States. Other countries have other regimes. Um, Obviously, state actors have very different relationships to state regulation than private actors do. So if you're in communication with a state that runs its own state markets, like India does, for example, they could simply decide that the regulations are satisfied because they're satisfied. Um, so those things change, but again, there's political dimension. It becomes more and more difficult to attach economic numbers to what that would look like.
So at this point, then, because there's a lot here to unpack, even for myself, as we've discussed this, I'm like, okay, there are things I need to better understand in this whole situation. And I'm going to go do that after our call. But to deploy it internationally or deploy it somewhere else, is that even, because you said there's other things that you'd have to consider for the return on it, but I'm guessing the primary thing holding you back from pursuit of this is the financial aspect.
For me to launch, I would need access to a lot more liquid capital than I've ever had access to. So that's the bar. There are 4 different projects in various stages of startup that are attempting to launch that would incorporate the technology. There's a version of the technology that's under an open source license, and overseas no IP attaches. I'm only pursuing the patent in the United States. I don't, it would also have cost millions of dollars to pursue an international patent. So that was never on the table. The patent has a few different potential sort of outcomes. One of the potential outcomes, in fact, was the confrontation that I'm presently in of creating a situation to enable the precedence of a meaningful decision about patents. I'm fairly skeptical of the existing patent infrastructure in light of what we know about math and physics, and how contradictory those are to the assumptions of the people that urged the creation of the patent office and have enabled the various versions of it that have existed over the last couple centuries in this country. So that, to me, would be a win, not necessarily for this project, but for my country. However, it is the case that existing large market players buy market mechanism patents. One of the spurious claims that has been made against me in the course of doing this, there were 5 different attempts to establish prior art, all of which they have admitted that are totally irrelevant. But one of them was this thing they call the Lang patent, and I could look up exactly what patent number it is. But Lang patent would probably find it, particularly Lang and parimutuel in Google Patents is probably good enough to find it. I think it was 800 pages long, and it reads pretty much like a PhD math dissertation, which I'm guessing, based on what I've seen, it probably was. And these guys patented parimutuel betting. They couldn't patent horse race gambling or, poker betting because those exist, but they patented everything else. And when I say everything else, I'm not kidding. I think it's section 8.1.1.2. I read this thing like 6-7 years ago, so I might have the number wrong, but that was very critical because in that section, they claim patent coverage of every conceivable parimutuel system with up to a countably infinite set of uh, betting pools.
It's disturbing.
Yeah, yeah, and they let that go through, and those guys sold that patent to the CME Group. So the CME Group may well be, or the Intercontinental Exchange, or the LME might be willing to buy it and, set up something to take over the US economy, or NASDAQ, or, somebody else, or Texas might well be willing to purchase this technology and use it. But it's currently unpurchasable because there is no such thing as intellectual property without the attachments. And while I own a copyright on various implementations that I have done, um, copyright would not stop somebody else from writing their own version. And because what's important isn't the exact words of the program, but the underlying functional structure, you would have to have a patent. Um, Things like uh, trade secret don't apply because this actually functions through transparency. So you, for trade secret to operate, you have to, plausibly be keeping a secret. And this only works if you're telling everybody how it's working. So that's, obviously no good.
A big part of it.
Yeah. Trademark is similarly, just a complete misapplication. So the only way for this to be an IP, an actual property, would be for the patent to be extended. And were the patent to be extended, it's still a long shot, but it isn't impossible that that could be sold to an existing player, and they could, go on to dominate the entire global economy for basically everything, unless somebody was using another version of the technology to compete with them.
Fascinating. This is honestly, I love how articulate you are and your ability to walk through these things. You can clearly tell that you understand the technology and that you built it. I know this may seem like a digression to you, but it isn't to me. One very famous quote by Elon Musk is when you have someone who's worked on a given project or they claim it, ask them to talk about their contribution. You'll find out real quick how much they actually did because they're able to talk to it. And you can tell that you understand the dynamics of this world very well. You understand this technology. Of course, you've developed it from the ground up. I just find it inspiring that this is really a novel development, what you have here. And I wish I could help with where you're currently at with the patent office.
Yeah, I don't really know what or where that all that's going to wind up. Um, uh, Basically, so I've got some stuff I need to file like today or tomorrow, and so I'm a little leery of the electronic. I had some problems. It rejected my password, and it's like this is the first time it's ever happened to me. But but I had to go a day and talk to customer service because it didn't like any of my passwords. Um, and then getting into it, there was some other issues. I think I got in too quickly, and so it hadn't caught up with itself, and it like wants to charge money for everything, and I don't have any money. So I'm very leery. I don't want to accidentally, destroy my case by clicking the wrong button. Um, so I need to kind of set aside a slot of time where I'm going to be able to basically get somebody on the phone to walk me through it step by step, just to make sure I don't do anything wrong. But yeah, the for for the Court of Appeals, it's pretty expeditious. Patents seem to actually be the longest frame version of anything. I get about 2 months to put together my case. And there's, I'm about a week into this. So, I've got, uh, what, like 56 days or something,
Yeah.
to put my case forward. And I have not written down all of that stuff about the specious arguments and the rest of it, but I've got some stuff in place, and it's rattling around. I need to actually write it down, which is challenging for me, but that I can do.
Have you
Uh,
considered preview to help you?
huh?
Preview.
Yeah, sure. That I'd be happy to kind of send you
No, no,
some.
no. What I'm trying to say is, so I augment a lot of my workflows by using different AI systems. And I know GPT, you wouldn't want to put any of the proprietary stuff in there per se. But you could use the new Preview O1 model to assemble a lot of your course arguments based off the documentation by simply copying and pasting it in. Or with the situation you're facing with the online filing, you take screenshots of the image display and say, hey, this is my contextual situation. You submit that to Claude Sonnet 3.5 or to GPT 4.0. It will know these sites because of the corpus it's been trained on, and then it will give you guidance. I use that a lot for ambiguous things I'm dealing with.
That's not a bad idea. I've used Claude Sonnet pretty extensively on a few different projects, and yeah, that it's going to be getting me past my sort of blank page writer's block on a couple of these pieces, and again, because of the nature of how IP works, I'm actually not terribly shy about the proprietariness of things. Um,
That
I'd
would use.
mentioned Yeah, I'd mentioned the story matrix to you, where I sort of broke down 16 or 17 different roles.
Yeah.
Google's latest notebook LM.
Oh, it's
Uh,
amazing.
I actually have a 15-minute conversation between the guy and the gal. That's a pretty solid sort of understanding, where I handed it the story matrix, the CDM overview diagram,
Yeah.
and the white paper, and they do like 15 minutes on how this is a revolutionary technology, and how it's different. So that's kind of cool. I just generated that yesterday.
I don't know
Uh,
if you want this stuff being publicly shared. If you do, I would be happy to integrate it with the newsletter and the podcast I can do off of this.
okay, yeah,
That's to
I'm
a web page.
yeah, I'm quite happy with sort of publication of this in every channel possible.
Okay.
Uh, so at any rate, uh, the patent office, and I'm in communication with the attorney that's handling the other side of the case. He put together over the weekend, or just like on Friday, uh, the draft appendix. So I get about 27 pages to describe what my grievance is, and then I think they get a pretty similar amount to describe what their response is. And they get about a month to create that response. Then I have it's optional at that point, but I have 2 weeks to rebut their response after that. And then all of that, whatever, gets balled up and sent to the court, and three judge panel makes their decision. Um, the the draft appendix that they put together is the 600 pages of communication between my law office and the patent office over the entire course of my pursuit of this. Um, if you include, I'm not doing this because I'm not sure whether it is appropriate or not, but if you include the communications between my law office and me,
Yeah.
the number of pages goes up dramatically, because we have drafts of these various things that in some cases went to a dozen or so. So there's probably tens of thousands of pages uh, uh, sort of sidelined. Well, certainly thousands between the in all that have been generated over the course of this entire thing. But I put in a request yesterday to put in some of the seminal papers, things like Shannon's on information theory, Haskell Curry's 1934 paper that basically points out what we now know as the Curry-Howard isomorphism, Turing's paper, a Britannica article on Morgenstern and von Neumann's work in game theory, and a couple other papers, including a NIST, National Institute of Science and Technology, I think, or Standards and Technology. They have a paper on big O notation and, in general, algorithmic analysis that goes back. That type of pursuit goes back to the 1800s, the late 1800s, and effectively establishes the baseline for how to analyze whether or not systems are better or worse than each other at various scales. And so I'm presenting these things as more or less the baseline knowledge that's required to make technical decisions that can be respected. And my case is that either they're completely ignorant of all of this, or they're lying. And that's it. Because in light of this knowledge, it is impossible to make any of the assertions that exist in their decision.
Is there any precedence in previous case law? And if you don't know, there is a system that uses AI to scan the entire case law database in reference to what you're going through.
So my case is actually unprecedented in a few different ways. One thing that happened to me that apparently has never happened to anybody else in American history is that they ignored a notice of acceptance. So when you get a patent, you're assigned a sort of a patent clerk and you communicate with them to decide whether or not what you're doing meets the requirements of the patent. And right. If they say yes, you're issued a notice of acceptance, and then you apply for the patent by taking that notice of acceptance, the text that it refers to that you both agreed to, and then you get the patent. There's a quality control step, and it's the government. Who knows what other bureaucratic nonsense might be able to happen? But if somebody somewhere decides that decision was improperly made, there's a procedure for withdrawing that notice of acceptance. That didn't happen to me. What happened to me was we got the acceptance. My lawyer got a call from my examiner's boss saying that she's sort of hearing through the grapevine that they're probably going to ignore that notice of acceptance. We apply for the patent. We don't hear back from them. And so when we follow up and say, hey, what's going on? We applied for the patent. We've got a notice of acceptance. They said, we're going to get back to you. We have to figure out why we're not doing this. And 4 months later, they come up with an objection that they're not going to patent it because multiplying by 1 and multiplying by 300,000 are the same operation. And it took a year.
Howard on Joe Rogan.
Yeah. I mean, if you can introduce me to Joe, I've got a hell of a story. In a year, they were forced to admit that was total and utter nonsense. And so they gave me a second notice of acceptance. We applied for the patent, and 3 weeks later, they withdrew that notice of acceptance.
Such bullshit.
And the excuse this time, because they were actually following the procedure, the excuse this time is that it was too good that I had patented all of economics.
I'm sorry. I'm just like, it's offensive.
It is. It is deeply, deeply offensive. That's why one of the choices that's available to the court is to declare that the U.S. government is an illegitimate tyranny, because I'm engaged in a Kafkaesque nightmare that is only justifiable if these people have absolute power and can simply declare that, the sun is purple and made out of cheese, and everybody just has to go along with it. Because multiplying by 100,000 and multiplying by one are different ideas conceptually.
So, I understand what you're going through better than you can possibly imagine. A company I've done a lot of work with was sued by the SEC. And when the lawsuit became public, we lost $500 million in liquidity in 48 hours. And we won the lawsuit, by the way. The SEC was sanctioned because all 42 or 45 counts they placed against us were patently fraudulent. And the federal judge ruled and sanctioned the SEC, not very much compared to what was spent, but roughly $2 million. And they shut down the office in my state for the SEC and fired the attorneys on staff. So I understand where you're coming from in ways, and I would argue that most of the current government agencies are indeed highly corrupt entities with a lot of intentional bureaucracy meant to obfuscate the abilities of people that aren't in the network, as we'll call it.
That certainly seems to explain a great deal of what's going on to everybody. I mean, I'll just kind of see what's happening. I will note I have a scheduled call coming in at around 9:30. So if my phone rings, I'll be skipping out of here.
No, you're fine. I've got everything we need for the podcast and for the newsletter, and I can prep that today.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
You were a great interview, so thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and like I said, if you'd like, I can grab that like Notebook ML thing, and I think there's a sharing.
I love that
or something. So
that'd be great.
So yeah, if I can figure all that out, and if I can't, I can at least send you sort of downloaded copies of everything. I'm sure.
I'd love that. I'm actually going to go into LM right now and see if I can figure that out. Because if I can, I'll text you.
Okay.
Hey, thank you so much. I'll see you later.
Yep. Bye-bye.